Montana Territory, early spring of 1877. The wind howled down from the snow-capped Bitterroot Mountains like it had a score to settle. Odessa Langdon had not seen a soul in 3 days, and she was beginning to think maybe that was a blessing. Her horses were tired, her hands cracked from cold, and the 2 small faces watching her from the back of the wagon were too quiet. She had not heard either of them cry since the river crossing 2 days ago, and that silence sat heavy in her chest. "Are we gonna sleep here again?" asked the small voice of her son Peter, 5 years old and too thin for his age. Odessa glanced at the sky. The clouds were low and gray. "No, baby, we're almost there." She was lying. They were nowhere near anything. When her husband had died last winter frozen stiff behind the barn with a bottle in his hand, his brothers had come to the farm like wolves. They took the land, the livestock, and would have taken her children too if she had not run. 1 sack of flour, 2 horses that barely knew how to pull, and everything she could carry in a wagon. She was 28 years old and already felt like her bones belonged to someone twice that. "Ma," whispered the younger one, Polly, just 3, clutching a ragged old cloth rabbit. "I'm cold." "I know, love." She climbed up and pulled the worn wool blanket higher over both children, tucking it around their small shoulders. Then she looked out across the wide plain and the dark line of trees far ahead. Smoke. A thin trail of it curling above the trees. Someone was out there. She slapped the reins. "Come on, giddy up." The wagon creaked forward. Perrin Kade was not expecting company. His cabin sat 8 miles from the nearest trail, tucked back in a fold of pine and rock near the foot of the mountains. He liked it that way. He had not laid eyes on another person in almost 2 months. That was by choice. The chopping block was slick with sap and wood chips when he saw the wagon coming through the trees. He stepped back, axe in hand, watching. It was no settler's wagon. The wheels were too worn, the horses too skinny. And the woman driving it, her coat was patched in 3 places, and she held the reins like someone who had learned only recently. Her face was pale, jaw set tight, but her eyes, he could see those even at a distance, were watching everything. 2 children peeked out from under a tarp in the back. He set the axe down. "You lost." The woman pulled the horses to a halt and stared at him a moment before answering. "No, I saw the smoke, thought maybe there was someone decent here." He nodded toward the wagon. "They yours," she nodded. "Mine and mine alone." He appreciated that. No excuses. No explanations. "Cabin's warm, you can bring them in." She hesitated, then climbed down and lifted the littlest boy into her arms. The older one followed, small hand clutching the edge of her coat. "I'm Perrin Kade," he said once they reached the porch. "Live here alone." "Odessa Langdon," she replied. "These are my boys, Peter and Polly." He stepped aside and let them in. The cabin smelled of pine and coffee. There was a low fire in the hearth and a pot of stew on the stove. Perrin grabbed extra blankets from the trunk by the wall and handed one to Odessa without a word. She wrapped it around the boys and settled them near the fire. Their heads sagged against her shoulders. Within minutes, both had fallen asleep. "You can eat," Perrin said, nodding toward the pot. "There's plenty." She stood slowly, like her muscles were stiff, and ladled stew into a tin bowl. She did not speak until she sat down at the small table. "Thank you." He nodded. They ate in silence except for the quiet popping of the fire. When she finished, she pushed the bowl aside and looked up at him for the first time since entering. Her eyes were green, sharp even through the tiredness. "I do not want charity." "I did not offer any," he said. "I mean to find work, somewhere safe." "For them? There is no town for 20 miles, just trees and me." Her jaw clenched. "Then I will keep going." He looked at the boys asleep by the fire. "They will not make it another night in that wagon." She looked away. Perrin stood, stepped outside, and came back with an armful of wood. He stacked it by the hearth and said, "You can stay. A few days, rest the horses." She did not answer, but her shoulders lowered a little. The next morning, Perrin found her outside chopping wood. She swung the axe hard, wrist crooked, wasting strength. "You are going to hurt yourself," he said. "I have done worse. I can see that. I am not helpless." He stepped forward and took the axe from her hands. "I never said you were." She stood there, breathing hard, watching him, then she turned and walked back to the cabin. Later that afternoon, while Polly napped and Peter helped Perrin stack wood, Odessa sat on the porch watching them. She did not say much, but Perrin noticed the way her eyes followed Peter closely, the way her hands never quite stopped moving. He brought her coffee. She nodded her thanks and held the tin cup with both hands. "My husband died last winter," she said quietly. "Left me nothing but debt and a bad name." Perrin nodded. "Mine died 3 years ago, fever." She left a garden half-planted and a pan of biscuits in the oven. Odessa looked at him, startled. "I thought you said you lived alone." "I do now." The silence stretched between them, heavy but not sharp. She was kind, he said, but tired all the time. Like she was waiting for something to get better. Odessa did not reply, but her eyes softened. By the 4th day, the boys were laughing. Polly followed Perrin around like a shadow while Peter helped him repair the fence by the creek. Odessa watched them from the porch, arms folded, a quiet look on her face. That evening, after they put the children to bed, Odessa sat by the fire sewing a ripped sleeve. Perrin brewed coffee and handed her a cup, then sat across from her. "You are good with them," she said. "I did not think I would be," he replied. "Me neither." He chuckled low. "You do better than most." She looked up. "You do not know most." "I know enough," she smiled. "Just a little." On the 6th morning, the horses were rested. The wagon was ready. Odessa packed their things while the boys chased each other around the cabin. Perrin watched from the woodpile, jaw tight. "You are really leaving?" he asked. "I have to try," she said. "They deserve more than borrowed blankets and someone else's fire." "You are not someone else." Her hands stilled. He stepped closer, face serious. "You could stay for good," she swallowed. Why, he did not answer with words. He reached for her hand, slow and careful, and held it. She did not pull away. "I do not know what I am doing," she whispered. "Neither do I," he admitted. She looked up at him, eyes bright and unsure. "But you want me to stay?" "I want you, all of you, if you want me to." She blinked, breath caught in her chest. Peter ran up behind them, tugging on her coat. "Can we stay, Ma? I like it here." She looked at her son, then back at Perrin. "Yes," she said, "we will stay." He pulled her close, arms wrapping around her carefully like he was afraid she might vanish. She leaned into his chest, eyes closed, and for the first time in months she let herself exhale. They were not running anymore, they were home. The snow began to melt from the edges, first the eaves of the cabin dripping steadily, the creek breaking open in thin cracks, the soft thaw of March creeping in below the pine roots. That first week after Odessa chose to stay, the land shifted beneath their feet. Not quickly, not loudly, but in the quiet work of change. Perrin's cabin, once a place of silence, now held the sounds of small feet and the soft rustle of fabric as Odessa moved through the rooms. She never interrupted the stillness, she moved with it, as if she'd always belonged to it, like a branch bending under snowfall but never breaking. Each morning began with heat from the stove and the scent of something warm on the fire. Odessa had taken to cooking before dawn, her hair pulled back in a braid that hung thick and black down her back. She didn't ask permission, and Perrin didn't offer any. He simply rose when the light reached the window and found her there, sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed from the heat, speaking in low tones to Polly, who still clung to her skirt when he was tired. Peter had started asking to carry things: wood, buckets of water, the trapline satchel. Perrin let him. Not for the help, but because of the way Peter stood taller each time he was trusted with something. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in rust and violet, Odessa sat on a flat stone by the water's edge while Perrin cleaned a rabbit from the day's snare. Her boots were off, feet bare over the slick, thawed moss on the bank. She didn't speak for a long time, only watched the water move. When she finally did, her voice was low, as if testing its place in the air. "I used to think if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to feel anything too long." Perrin didn't look up. The rabbit's skin came off clean, practiced. "Does it work?" "Only for a little while." She reached down and let her fingers skim the surface. Then something catches up. He wiped his hands on a cloth. "What caught you?" She turned and met his eyes. "Kindness." Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep, she brought out a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth. She unwrapped it slowly at the table, revealing a carved piece of wood shaped like a hawk in flight. The wings were smoothed down from handling, the paint long faded. "My father carved this when I was little," she said. "He told me to carry it if I ever needed to be brave." Perrin studied it. The shape was simple, but the lines were careful craft made from patience, not tools. "It's held up." She touched the wingtip with one finger. "I didn't carry it during the worst parts. I thought I didn't deserve it anymore." He waited. "When I left the farm, I found it again in the bottom of an old flour tin. I think I needed to remember something." Perrin didn't speak. He reached across the table and touched the edge of her hand, not grasping, just presence. Odessa didn't pull away. The next morning, they rode north together, leaving Polly with Peter and a promise of return before nightfall. Odessa rode behind Perrin on the mule, her hands light on his waist, the wind catching strands of her hair like threads pulled loose from the past. They stopped near a wide meadow Perrin called Whispering Hollow, where the trees leaned in toward each other and the grass grew high even in early spring. He brought her there to show her something. "There's wild mint here," he said, crouching low. "You can boil it into tea once it comes in." She knelt beside him, brushing the soft new shoots with her fingers. "It smells like summers before I had to worry." They stayed like that, knees in the damp earth, hands brushing green, until the sun passed behind the trees. On the ride back, Odessa leaned her head lightly against Perrin's back. It was not a declaration, but it was something true. He did not speak, but his hand moved to cover hers at his waist. The thaw deepened. Odessa began sewing more, mending the boys' shirts and letting Peter help patch the seams with clumsy, proud stitches. Perrin brought back an old wash basin he hadn't used in years, and Odessa scrubbed it clean until it shone like tin in the sun. One night, just after supper, a knock came at the door, a sharp, unfamiliar sound that drew Polly to Odessa's side in an instant. Perrin opened it to find a man standing there, tall, lean, with deep lines around his mouth and a rifle slung over one shoulder. His coat was army issue, the buttons tarnished. "Name's Yarrow," he said. "I trap west of here, saw smoke, thought I'd check." Perrin stepped aside but didn't smile. "We're fed and clean," he said. "Ain't nothing needing checking." Yarrow glanced past him, eyes landing on Odessa. "Didn't know you took in boarders." "I didn't," said Perrin. Yarrow raised one brow. "You planning to stay holed up all season?" Perrin didn't answer. Odessa stepped forward then, chin lifted. "We don't need anything." Yarrow looked her over, slow and assessing. "Didn't say you did." Perrin's hand tightened on the doorframe, but Odessa reached past him and shut the door gently, not slamming it, just closing the space. Later, as the boys slept, Perrin sat sharpening his blade by the fire, the motion steady. "He doesn't mean trouble," he said. "But he watches too long." Odessa folded the quilt at the edge of the bench. "I've known men like that. He won't come back." She nodded, then sat beside him. "If he does, I won't hide." Perrin met her eyes. "You won't have to." The next day, Perrin brought out a small pouch wrapped in buckskin. Inside was a ring carved from bone, the surface rubbed smooth, edges inked with fine lines shaped like pine needles. "I made this after my wife passed," he said. "Didn't know why I kept it." Odessa stared at it, fingers hovering. "I do now." He cleared his throat. "I want to build something with you if you want me to." Her breath caught, but she didn't waver. "I do." He slid the ring onto her finger and she closed her hand around his. Outside, the creek ran clear, and the ice had vanished from its banks. The thaw brought more than water. Wild geese returned in tight formation, and with them came the brittle hum of change in the air. Odessa stood in the doorway of the cabin one morning, her shawl drawn close, watching a pair of them settle by the creek, necks arching like questions. The wind stirred her braid, lifting loose strands against her cheek, and she didn't smooth them away. Somewhere in the trees, a hawk called once, and the sound felt like an echo of something she hadn't yet named. Perrin had gone out early, heading west to check the ridge traps. With the weather turning, the pines would begin to shed their snow and game would start moving again. He'd taken Peter with him, the boy insistent on carrying his own satchel. Odessa had helped him tie it tight across his chest, her fingers lingering longer than needed. She'd kissed his forehead without a word, and he'd nodded like a man twice his size before following Perrin into the woods. Inside, Polly sat cross-legged on a wool blanket, carefully arranging a pile of pebbles by size. He hummed to himself, tuneless and soft. Odessa crouched beside him and touched the top of his head. "You're getting tall," she said. He didn't answer, just offered her one of the stones, and she took it, folding it into her palm as if it were something precious. By mid-morning, she'd swept the hearth, kneaded dough for flatbread, and filled the stove kettle twice. The quiet pressed in, not heavy but thick enough to make her restless. She stepped outside, breathing deep. The air held the first green edge of spring, not the sharp pine of winter, but the wet loam of earth waking up. A rustle near the tree line drew her attention. Her hand went to the knife at her belt before she saw him. He moved with the quiet of someone who'd never needed to announce himself. Tall, lean, with dark braids and a hide-wrapped bundle slung across his back. His face was weather-worn, cheekbones high, eyes steady. He paused before stepping fully into view, as if offering her the choice to call out first. She didn't speak. Just lowered her hand from the knife. He nodded once, then approached. When he reached the porch, he paused again. His gaze flicked toward the cabin, then settled back on her. "I saw smoke yesterday," he said. "Thought someone might be hurt." Her voice came carefully. "We're whole." He studied her in silence, then untied the bundle and set it down. "I left food, dried elk, enough for a week." She looked at it, then back at him. "You didn't have to, I know." He turned to go. "Wait," she said, stepping down. "What's your name?" He looked over his shoulder. "Tama," she hesitated. "Odessa?" He nodded again, then disappeared into the trees as silently as he'd come. The next time he came, 3 days later, Perrin was home. Tama approached with the same quiet, but this time he didn't stop at the tree line. Peter, sitting on the ground with a length of snare wire, stood when he saw him and took a step toward the porch. Perrin emerged from the shed, wiping his hands on a rag. "You know him?" he asked Odessa under his breath. She shook her head. "Only his name." Perrin stepped forward. "You're far from your people." Tama met his eyes. "You are far from yours." Neither of them moved. Odessa stepped between them. "He brought food when he thought we were in trouble." Perrin glanced at her, then back at Tama. "You want something?" "I came to see if the children were still well. We keep them fed, warm, and clean." "I see that." Perrin's jaw tightened, but his hands stayed at his sides. Odessa touched his arm. "Let him sit." "Just for a little while." Inside, Polly reached up to Tama without hesitation, and the man crouched, letting the boy touch the beaded cuff at his wrist. Odessa watched the way Tama's face softened, not with a smile, but with stillness, the kind that came from listening closely. Perrin didn't relax, not fully, but he poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table. That night in their bed, Odessa lay with her head on Perrin's chest, her fingers tracing the buttons of his shirt through the fabric. "He didn't mean harm," she said. "No," Perrin said. "But I don't know what he means." "He's alone." "So were we." She closed her eyes. "He moves like someone who's had to stay quiet for too long." Perrin didn't answer, but his hand came up to rest at the base of her neck, his thumb brushing the edge of her collarbone. She felt him thinking, and the weight of it didn't trouble her. In the weeks that followed, Tama returned 3 more times. Never unannounced, never lingering. He brought cedar bark for the stove, a cured hide for the boys to sit on, and once a bundle of dried berries Odessa didn't recognize. She learned to say thank you without asking why. One evening, after the boys had gone to sleep, she stepped outside and found Tama seated near the edge of the clearing, his back resting against a mossy boulder. She sat beside him wordlessly. He passed her a small wooden bowl filled with dried root slices. She took one, bit into it, and tasted something sharp and sweet. "It helps the blood," he said. They sat in silence for a while, the stars cold and sharp above them. "Why me?" she asked. His answer was simple. "You were still breathing." She looked down at the bowl. "I don't remember falling." "You didn't fall, you sat down." She drew her knees up, arms around them. "I thought I'd be alone forever. Even trees lean on each other in wind," her breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the grief sitting quiet in the corners of his eyes. "Who did you lose?" she asked. He didn't answer. But he didn't get up and leave either. When she returned to the cabin, Perrin was awake. He sat by the hearth, his boots still on, a length of cord in his hands. "You were with him," she nodded. He didn't speak for a while. "Then you're still wearing my ring." She crossed the room and knelt in front of him. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked down at her hands. "I never thought I'd have to share the warmth. You aren't." He reached out and cupped the side of her face, his hand rough but careful. "Then tell me what you need." "I need you to trust me," she whispered. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. "I do." Spring settled in earnest after that. The creek widened, the grass thickened, and the trees filled with birdsong. Odessa planted herbs in a narrow bed along the side of the cabin. Peter helped, his fingers careful as he pressed seeds into the soil. Polly followed behind, dropping rocks into the dirt when he thought no one was looking. One afternoon, Tama arrived with a small blade wrapped in deerskin. "For the boy," he said, handing it to Peter. "To learn." Perrin took it first, examining the edge, then passed it to his stepson with a nod. "You keep it clean, and don't ever point it at your brother." Peter's eyes were wide with pride. "Yes, sir." That night, Perrin sat beside Odessa on the porch as dusk deepened. His hand found hers in the dark. "He's not here for you," he said quietly. "He's here because he lost someone too." Odessa nodded. "I know. I just needed to say it." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you." He exhaled slow, like it reached down into something he'd been holding tight. "I love you too." The stars blinked on, one by one, until the sky was full. No one moved. Nothing needed saying. The fire inside crackled low, the children asleep in warmth, and for once the stillness didn't feel like waiting. It felt like peace. The first time Odessa saw the meadow in bloom, she cried. It wasn't the kind of crying she'd known back in Kansas, when grief had pressed down with the weight of a winter roof ready to cave. These tears came without warning, threading down her cheeks as she stood in knee-high grasses, the sun brushing her face and the wind carrying the sweet, sharp scent of wild sage and early lupine. She didn't sob, she didn't make a sound. She just let the tears fall, her hands still deep in the soil she'd tilled with Peter and Perrin over the past week. Tama stood a short distance away, not looking at her but not turning from her either. He held a woven pouch across his chest and waited until her hands stilled before coming forward. "There's a place farther west," he said, offering her the pouch. "River runs clear, no traps. I fish there when I need to remember." She took the pouch but didn't open it. "Do you remember often?" He shook his head. "Only when I forget what I still have." Perrin and Peter joined them from the woods, carrying bundles of pine kindling. Odessa tucked the pouch into her pocket and stood. Her face was dry now, and she didn't glance back at the meadow. That night, Perrin carved a new handle for Polly's small wooden cup. Odessa watched from the table as his hands moved with quiet purpose, the blade slicing smooth curls from the cedar, the firelight catching on the sweat at his brow. She didn't interrupt him. She just studied the way his fingers curled around the knife, the way his shoulders bent forward slightly, focused. "I think I want to start teaching," she said finally. He didn't look up. "You've been teaching since the day you walked in here." "I mean proper, letters." "Reading." He wiped his hand on a cloth, set the knife aside. "You thinking of going back to town?" "No, I've had enough of towns." "Then who are you teaching?" She reached for the old ledger book she'd salvaged from the wagon and set it on the table. "Peter first, then Polly." "Maybe others, if there are families quietly settled out here. Not everyone wants to send their children downriver to be taught things they don't understand." Perrin leaned back in his chair. "You'd build a school?" "Not a building. Not yet." Just a table, a fire, and someone willing to listen. He nodded slowly. You'd be good at it. I'd like to be. Peter came in from the porch, hands and knees streaked with dirt. The traps were empty, he announced. But I saw a fox. Odessa motioned him over and brushed the leaves from his shirt. Let him be, he's not hurting anyone. Perrin reached into his pocket and pulled out a long, rough feather. Was it this color? Peter's eyes widened. Exactly. Then he's a smart one. He's been dodging my snares since last October. Peter grinned and tucked the feather into his belt. By the following week, Odessa had cleared a corner of the cabin and fashioned a small desk from spare planks. She found an old slate board among Perrin's storage crates and cleaned it with vinegar and ash. When Tama arrived that Thursday, he brought her a bundle of charcoal wrapped in hide. For the boy, he asked, setting it on the windowsill. For the both of them, she said. And maybe you, if you ever want to sit a while. He didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on the slate. Later, as the boys napped, Odessa watched Tama from the window. He stood near the edge of the clearing, shoulders still, head tilted toward the wind. You've never asked what I ran from, she said, stepping outside. Tama didn't turn. I don't need to know. I think I need to tell someone. He stayed quiet. My husband drank, not at first, not when we met, but after Peter was born, something in him shifted. He never hit me, but he stopped seeing me, like I was just another wall in the house. Tama's gaze stayed on the treetops. He died during a snowstorm. I didn't cry. I just packed what I could and left before his brothers came looking for what wasn't theirs. Tama finally turned. His face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. You were not wrong to leave. I think I wanted someone to tell me that. He nodded once. Then you have it. That night, Odessa sat on the porch with Perrin after the boys had gone to bed. She leaned back against his chest, his arm across her middle, and watched the sky deepen from gold to indigo. I told Tama about William, she said. Perrin didn't stiffen. He just shifted his hands slightly, fingers resting at her ribs. I wanted to say it out loud to someone who didn't know me then, someone who wouldn't look at me like I was something broken. Perrin's voice came low. You're not broken. She turned her head to look at him. You've never asked about him. I didn't need to. I saw what you carried. I figured if you wanted me to know his name, you'd say it. She nodded, and they fell into silence again, the kind that didn't demand anything. The next day, Odessa found Polly sitting cross-legged beneath the maple tree, the ledger book open in his lap. He wasn't reading, just flipping the pages slowly, his lips moving. She crouched beside him. You want to learn your letters? She asked. He looked up and nodded, serious. She pulled him onto her lap, set the book between them, and began to trace the first letter with his finger. He didn't speak, but his breath caught each time she guided his hand. By the time Perrin returned from the ridge, Odessa had drawn 6 letters on the slate, and Polly had memorized 3 of them. Perrin crouched beside them. That's more than I knew until I was 10. Odessa smiled at him. Then we'll have to catch you up. That night, as the fire burned low, Perrin reached into the drawer of his workbench and pulled out a narrow box. He handed it to Odessa without a word. She opened it slowly. Inside was a silver ring, plain and narrow, with a single line etched around its center. No stone, no flourish, just something quiet and certain. She looked up, her throat tight. We've already built the life, he said. This is just the part where we say it out loud. She didn't cry, though her chest ached with the weight of it. Yes, she said. Perrin slid the ring onto her hand. It fit without effort. I won't ask you to wear white, he said, but I'll ask you to wear this. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. I'll wear it as long as my hands still work. They told the boys the next morning. Peter asked if that meant he could call Perrin Pa. Perrin said he could call him anything he liked, so long as he kept his boots outside and his knife clean. Polly just nodded and went back to copying the letter B on the slate. A week later, Tama arrived with a bundle of dried juniper and a length of red cloth. For your fire, he said, handing the bundle to Perrin. Perrin accepted it without question. Odessa reached for the cloth. It was soft, dyed deep with root and bark, the edges stitched with sinew. She didn't ask what it was for. She just folded it carefully and set it in the trunk at the foot of her bed. They married beneath the maple tree, with the boys standing on either side and Tama watching from the edge of the clearing. There was no minister, no paper, just hands joined and promises spoken clear and true. When Perrin kissed her, it wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss given by someone who'd waited long enough to know what it meant to stay. Afterward, Odessa pressed her forehead to his and whispered something only he heard. He nodded once, then lifted her hand to his chest and held it there. The sun filtered through the leaves above them, dappling their hair, their shoulders, the ground where their feet stood. They didn't dance. They didn't sing. They just stood there, holding each other, while the boys chased each other through the tall grass and Tama turned back toward the trees, leaving them in peace. That night, Odessa lay beside Perrin and listened to the wind shift through the pines. Her ring caught the firelight, casting a thin silver line across his chest where her hand rested. "I never thought I'd be warm again," she said. His voice came quiet, steady. "You never have to be cold again," and she believed him. The meadow grass was knee-high by June, the lupine yellowing at the tips, petals thinning in the wind. Odessa stood at the edge of the clearing with her hands resting on the small of her back, watching Polly walk a crooked line between the rows of sprouting carrots. He took his task seriously, checking the soil around each green sprig for weeds and pulling them with care. The boy had grown steadier in the weeks since the wedding, his silences less heavy, his laughter quick to surface and unforced. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. Perrin stepped down barefoot, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a shallow tin pan balanced in one hand. "You're letting the sun burn your neck," he said. Odessa didn't move. "I like the warmth." He joined her, the pan clinking as he set it down on the porch rail. "Bread's rising." "I thought I'd try baking it in the coals this time." She turned slightly, one eyebrow raised. "That's bold, could be disaster." He leaned a shoulder against the post. "Could be genius, I'll take either." Odessa reached out and touched his forearm. "You always take your chances slow. Except when I don't." He slid his hand over hers and didn't let go. They stood like that for a while, watching Polly hum tunelessly as he worked his way toward the end of the row. The light had softened, the clouds high and thin, and the smell of pine pitch drifted down from the western slope. "I got a letter," Odessa said, her voice low. Perrin turned toward her. "From where?" "Bozeman. There's a woman there named Clara Norwood who teaches in the mission school. They're short a hand and asked if I'd come in once a month. Bring anything I've written down. Share it." He didn't answer right away. He watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with the steadiness of someone who'd learned not to guess until all the truth was in. "I told her I'd consider it," she added. "But I wouldn't go without you, without the boys." He looked toward the trees. "It's a long ride. 2 days each way, wouldn't be home long." "No, but it's only once a month." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You want to go?" "I want to teach more than one child. I want to help women like I was ones who don't know what they're allowed to ask for." "You'd sleep where?" "They have a small house behind the chapel." She said there's room. Perrin nodded slowly. "We'd go with you." Her chest loosened. "You sure?" "I married you to build something. That doesn't mean we stay nailed to one spot. We'll find a way." She stepped forward and leaned into him, her cheek against the curve of his shoulder. "I don't want to leave this place." "You're not. You're just stretching out from it." That night they talked it over with Peter. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes older than they should have been. He didn't ask if they'd come back. He asked if he could keep learning while they were gone. Perrin handed him a folded sheet of paper. "You'll keep a journal, 1 line a day, that's your work." Peter nodded solemnly. "And what about the garden? You'll help Tama with it," Odessa said. "He's offered to stay when we're away. He can't read, but he understands seeds." Polly looked up from where he was drawing letters in the ash by the hearth. "Will he sleep here?" "No," Perrin said. "He'll come in the morning and leave at dusk. He's not one for roofs." The plan settled like stones in a stream, practical, steady, and clear. 2 weeks later, Odessa packed a satchel with her notes, extra paper, and the red cloth Tama had given her, folded tight beside the ledger. They left at dawn, the wagon hitched with fresh-cut pine poles and a canvas cover sewn by Odessa herself. The ride was long and quiet. They camped beside a river the first night, Perrin setting a fire low and careful, smoke curling into the branches above. Odessa read to the boys by lamplight, her voice soft, the words steady. Polly fell asleep with his head on her lap. Peter stayed awake, listening even after his eyes closed. By the time they reached Bozeman, the sky had turned dusty blue with heat and the hills were gold at the edges. Clara Norwood met them at the edge of the chapel garden, her sleeves rolled and a long smudge of dirt across her cheek. She studied Odessa carefully, then looked at Perrin, then the boys. "You don't look the way I pictured," she said. "Good," Odessa replied. "I don't aim to be pictured." They stayed 5 days. Odessa taught 2 classes in the shade of the chapel's back porch, her skirt hem dusted with chalk. She showed the women how to dry their own inks from berries, how to bind papers with sinew, how to teach their daughters to write their names with something more than borrowed letters. Perrin fixed the chapel's stovepipe and helped build a bench near the garden. Peter wrote in his journal each morning and let the younger children follow him around like ducklings. Polly made friends with a girl named Ruth, who showed him how to chew pine needles without gagging. On the 6th day, they left with a jar of dried herbs, a bag of oats, and a stack of new letters from the women Odessa had taught. The ride home was slower, the wagon heavier, but no one complained. Tama was waiting when they reached the clearing. He had weeded the garden, stacked fresh wood by the shed, and left a bundle of dried mint tied with twine on the porch rail. Perrin handed him a cloth-wrapped parcel. "From Bozeman, dried peaches." Tama accepted it without speaking and nodded once before disappearing into the trees. That night, Odessa sat at the table with her journal open, a new page waiting. Perrin poured water into the basin and set the pitcher down with a soft clink. "You look like someone with something to write," he said. She dipped her pen into the ink and met his eyes. "I'm writing about staying," he quirked an eyebrow. "I thought you just came back from leaving. That's the thing, I left and I still came back here, so now I know the difference." He crossed the room, pulled a chair beside her and leaned his elbows on the table. "Teach me," he said. She blinked. "To write, to stay." She closed the journal, leaned over, and kissed him. "You already know how. You're here." Fall came early that year. The trees turned fast, gold and rust sweeping through the ridgeline like fire. Odessa taught beneath the maple tree on clear days, the boys seated on blankets with slates balanced on their knees. Sometimes Clara Norwood sent letters, always addressed to Mrs. Langdon Kade, and always with a list of names. Women who needed help. Girls who had never seen their own names written down. Odessa answered everyone. Perrin built a second room onto the cabin before the frost came. It faced east, with a narrow window that caught the morning light. He carved an oak shelf into the wall for Odessa's books, and when she stepped inside for the first time, she didn't speak. She just touched the shelf, then turned and kissed him until neither of them remembered to speak at all. Peter grew tall before winter, his shoulders squaring, his voice deepening. He still wrote in his journal 1 line a day, the pages filling with observations and questions. Polly learned to read by the firelight, his fingers sliding under each word slowly, then faster until he no longer needed help. In the evenings, Odessa and Perrin sat by the hearth, her sewing in her lap, his hands busy carving small toys from leftover pine. They didn't speak often, but they didn't need to. Their silences were full. One night, as the first snow fell outside, Perrin reached for her hand. "Do you ever miss what you left?" She looked over at the boys, both asleep on their bedrolls near the fire, then back at him. "I miss the girl I was before I had to run, but I wouldn't trade her for the woman I am now." He kissed her palm. "Then we'll keep building." And they did. They built a life with steady hands and quiet hours. They taught, they grew, they listened. They stayed. When spring came again, it came gently. and in the warmth of new grass and long days, Odessa stood at the edge of the clearing with Perrin beside her, their fingers laced. Polly dragged a stick through the dirt, drawing letters. Peter stood beside the shed, sketching the hawk he saw circling above with practiced strokes. Odessa tilted her head and listened. The wind carried no sound of fear. Only leaves, birds, and the slow, contented rhythm of a home that had been earned. She leaned her head on Perrin's shoulder. "We're not running anymore," he kissed her temple. "No, we're rooted.